Hello, everyone. This is Michele Cruse from CCLP, the Fabulous Cohort 21. Veronica Garcia and Alicia Moore and I have prepared and will be presenting a case brief for you today on LaFleur versus Wallace State Community College. So let's start off with some basic facts of the case. We have Gwendolyn LaFleur, who was hired under a 9-month contract as a full-time professor of business and secretarial science for Wallace State Community College between the academic years of 92 and 93. So I'm going to refer to Wallace State Community College as WSCC from here on out. So WSCC hires full-time faculty under a 3-year probationary contract. The contract may be non-renewed without cause at the end of any contract year. WSCC has 92 full-time faculty members, of which only 4 at that time between 92 and 93, the academic year of 92 and 93, were African American. And none of the African American faculty worked in the business department. Since the year of 1975, WSCC had been under federal court order to actively recruit qualified African American applicants. So thus moving it back into the 92-93 academic year, during LaFleur's interview, WSCC's academic dean, Robert Guthrie, indicated that LaFleur's salary would be at a specific level. Well, after she was hired, another staff member reviewed LaFleur's credentials for the purposes of salary placement and discovered that her doctorate degree was from an unaccredited institution. As such, she was placed at a lower level on the salary schedule. So LaFleur appealed this decision to the academic dean and the college president on multiple occasions. During her first academic year, LaFleur's immediate supervisor, her name was Joanne Hathcott, had made several or multiple racially derogatory statements regarding African Americans, which some of the statements included or regarded slavery and lynching, among other derogatory statements and slurs. And some of these statements were actually witnessed by other WSCC personnel. Well, at the end of the first year, WSCC decided not to renew LaFleur's contract under the auspices of several different things. One being that LaFleur had missed a meeting with the dean and president. She had missed multiple unauthorized work days and the annual commencement ceremony, which was a required event for all faculty members. In addition, they said that she insisted on additional pay for her teaching load, even though her teaching load fell within the college's standards. They said she was not a team player, and they anticipated that her current negative behavior would escalate in the future. So, obviously, or more so, LaFleur at that point filed a lawsuit under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act and the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, as enforced by Section 1983, claiming that her contract was not renewed due to her race. So LaFleur asked for declaratory and injunctive relief, reinstatement to her position, back pay and benefits, in addition to attorney fees. So the primary issue in the LaFleur versus Wallace State Community College case is whether the plaintiff's contract was not renewed due to her race. Therefore, the court's first decision focused on the race discrimination claim. And as part of the racial discrimination claim, the plaintiff asserted the disparate treatment theory. So further, a racial discrimination claim is meet the following burdens of proof, and I'm going to talk about 4 specifically. The first, that she belongs to a protected class. The second, that she was actually qualified for the position. Third, that the contract was not renewed regardless of her qualifications. And finally, that she was replaced by a person that was not from a protected class with equal or less qualifications. So based on this information provided by the defendants, the courts also later addressed whether the 11th Amendment's immunity clause applied to potential remedies. So note that the burden of proof standard for this case is a preponderance of evidence, and this is similar to what is used in campus student conduct hearings. So thus this actually means that the evidence provided is more likely true than not. So moving on to the court's decision. The process used in this case was actually a bench trial, and this means that the decisions were made by the judge as a sole fact finder of the case. So ultimately, the court ruled that the plaintiff prevailed and noted the following findings. 1, acknowledging that the plaintiff was not a model employee. And then the court concluded that it was more likely than not, preponderance of evidence standard, that race was the primary reason for not renewing the plaintiff's contract. In addition, Ms. Hathcote, the supervisor, she was the primary person responsible for the discriminatory decisions, and that race was not a factor in how and where LaFleur was placed on the initial salary schedule. In addition, the court also ruled that the plaintiff was not entitled to a Section 1983 claim against WSCC. So now let's move into the court's rationale. So regarding the discrimination complaint, the court's rationale was that the evidence provided met the standards required for a discrimination claim. And there's four, with the following specifics, and there were four. The first being that the plaintiff demonstrated that she was part of a protected class. Secondly, the plaintiff met the minimum requirements for the actual position. And third, while the defendants offered other reasons for the plaintiff's dismissal, the reasons that were provided to the courts did not convince them that they were substantial enough to justify a non-renewal of her contract. And then finally, the defendants hired someone who was not a member of a protected class with equal qualifications to replace the plaintiff. So it's important to note that the court made several other findings in support of race being the primary factor of contract non-renewal. And so among these, there were several, and I'll just kind of slowly go on the list here. So one, the plaintiff was the only African-American instructor employed by the Business Education Department. Secondly, that racial slurs were actually made by the supervisor, which was Hathcote. In addition to that, the defendant's agreement that the plaintiff's teaching skills were strong, but there was a lack of objective elements among the faculty in which the faculty were actually evaluated, thereby increasing the opportunity for discrimination. In addition, that the decision to dismiss LaFleur was made by white supervisors. Well, I just say that again. So the actual decision, since it was actually made by LaFleur supervisors who were actually white. The reasons that they provided the defendant for LaFleur's dismissal were not substantial in nature. And finally, so if holding a doctorate degree from an accredited institution was such a critical factor in the hiring qualifications, and this was asserted by the defendants, the defendant should have included this in the hiring statement. So moving on to regarding the salary placement, the court's rationale was that WSCC's president made a good faith effort in attempting to discuss salary placement, and that the court actually believed the president's testimony. And then finally, regarding rejection of the 1983 claim, the court found that given WSCC's status as a government entity, a Section 1983 claim is not possible. So moving along to the procedural history and background of the case, and then we'll follow with the implication of questions. So here, we're going to talk a little bit about the court. So the court, in particular, this case was heard by the U.S. District Court of Alabama, the Northern Division. And this case was not appealed. And so I want to talk a little bit about three implications for community colleges here, with the first being the court found that if an institution believed that the academic credentials must be from an accredited institution, then WSCC should have noted this on the job announcement. So while accreditation status is usually a given within higher education, the court's decision may influence whether institutions should add this to their clarification to job announcements, job descriptions, contracts, or other documents which are associated with the hiring and employment of individuals in which a certificate or degree is required. Secondly, we agree that the court we would agree with the court that the reasons presented by WSCC were weak at best. However, this does reiterate the need that when legitimate situations warrant the dismissal of an employee, colleges and universities must clearly articulate how those reasons connect to a job description, written performance expectations, an employee contract, or other official documents. And finally, colleges and universities should be clear on the role that each individual plays within the institution, so clearly defining who is culpable in legal matters. Depending on state governing regulations, institutions may also wish to consider specialized insurance for senior leadership that may assist in potential litigation. So our group came up with a couple questions here, and we're going to talk a little bit about two. So the first is, while we understand the preponderance of evidence standard, we were struck by several findings in which the judge indicated that he or she believed an individual's testimony and or found it suspicious. So this seems somewhat arbitrary and subjective. Is this typical in bench trials in which the preponderance of evidence standard is used? And secondly, the plaintiff's testimony seemed to lend itself towards a hostile work environment complaint. So were these standards unavailable to non-sexual harassment situations at the time? So those were two of the questions that our group had. So finally, we want to end with other items to note. So while the primary issue in the LaFleur versus Wallace State Community College case was whether race was a factor in non-renewal of the plaintiff's contract, the court also was required to render findings as related to potential remedies. So a couple things that we noted were, so the court determined that receipt of back pay and lost benefits was actually appropriate, noting that the institution was responsible, not the WSCC president, as was initially asserted by the plaintiff. Secondly, the court declined to reinstate the plaintiff to her position. So the rationale for this was that the nature of the relationship between the plaintiff and the defendant was already challenged and would only grow should the plaintiff be reinstated to the position. In addition, someone else had already been appointed to the plaintiff's position, and reinstating LaFleur would have caused the new employee to be bumped, an action that's very sparingly used in other cases. Third, the court declined to pose injunctive relief, stating that payment of back pay was enough to incent the institution to avoid future discriminatory actions. And finally, the court did agree that the institution needed to pay the plaintiff's attorney fees. So this concludes our presentation, and we hope that you have learned a lot about this case. We certainly did. We will make available the presentation. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to any one of us in the group. Our email addresses are within the class. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.